Kia ora koutou. Welcome everybody that's slowly coming online. There's always this awkward period at the start of these online webinars where people are dribbling on and we're waiting for everyone to just zone in. So I won't talk slowly, but I will take my time just to say thanks for making the time to join us this afternoon. For 1 hour, we have to look and discuss about the health and safety amendments that have just been recently introduced to the Select Committee. Really appreciate you coming along to hopefully get some perspectives from two well-regarded friends of the forum and experts in their respective fields. Mike Cosman, independent health and safety expert and governance of Primo, and independent task force member, and worn a number of hats over the years. Mike, thanks for joining us. And Olivia Lund, a partner at Duncan Cotterill, an experienced health and safety lawyer among, I'm sure, many other disciplines in the legal profession. And Olivia's joined us before, so will be a familiar face to many on the call. So Olivia, thanks for coming along. So we've got an hour, ladies and gentlemen, and the objective really with the Health and Safety Amendment Bill now in front of the Select Committee is to provide you all a chance to hear what both Mike and Olivia think about the amendments as they see them to date, to provide some commentary and some comments around what they see as both problematic or concerning or yet to be defined, as well as where the opportunities and some of the strengths may lie in them. The forum will be making its own submission. This conversation will be helping inform that, but as are your member views through some drop-in sessions that we've been running. We've got one left on Thursday. We hope we can get some more people along too. But so today is not about Olivia or Mike talking to the forum's position. It's about talking about how they see the world to inform you, to inform us, but also hopefully to inform you to make a submission in your own right as well. And I'll refer at the back end, we're going to be doing some active work to support you to make a submission in your own name. I'm going to hand over to Mike presently just to provide us what I've called a sort of a straight bat objective description of what are the amendments objectively. And then we'll go over to Olivia for some opening remarks around how she's seen them. We'll come back to Mike, and then from there we will dig into a couple of those issues a little bit more deeply. We've got the Q&A open, so please put your questions throughout so that we can actually keep a track on those, and we will attend to them in flight. We are recording the session, not to attribute any feedback to anyone, but we thought we would make this available to people actually as a resource for your own consideration going forward. So we will be doing that, just so you know. I guess my opening remarks is that we're finally at the point now where we have an amendment bill in front of the Select Committee that's come after 2 years of discussion, engagement, consultation, policy consideration, led by Minister Brooke van Velden. Very, very strong intent throughout that period and process around the importance to, and unsurprisingly, I think, given where Minister van Velden and this government has come from, around how do we declutter and simplify and clarify to cut out administrative burden for the sake of it. But I guess, obviously, with a Health and Safety Forum and a Health and Safety Act, we're really also interested around its impact around health and safety performance. And lest we forget, New Zealand's health and safety performance remains a struggle. Our latest State of a Thriving Nation report put the cost of harm at $5.4 billion in 2024. That would have been 4.4 billion if we had the performance rate of Australia across fatality, injury, and illness. So there remains clear delta between us and competing jurisdictions that we like to compare ourselves with, and a drag on our economy, which feels very, very preventable and avoidable. So I think the prospect of us being able to understand collectively and individually what are the things we need to do from a legislative and regulatory perspective to reduce the drag and reduce mindless duplication deserves our full support. We also need to ensure that it actually lands on the things that are going to make the most material difference. So really today's conversation is about opening that up to help inform you, like I say, to inform us. So therein lies where today's conversation is. So, Mike, I'll hand over to you. If you want to elaborate on your introduction, please feel free. And then, what are we dealing with? What is Minister and MB put in front of the Select Committee for us to think about?
Thanks, Francois. Afternoon, everybody. So I guess just by way of context, not about me, but about the reform. As you say, it's come about from the minister. But the important thing is to recognise that this was actually part of the coalition agreement between ACT and National. So something that ACT had clearly identified as an issue prior to the formation of the current government, and this is now the culmination of that review process, a number of cabinet papers and announcements that the minister has made. So what is it? So the Health and Safety at Work Amendment Bill actually amends not only the primary act, the Health and Safety at Work Act, it also amends the WorkSafe New Zealand Act and has some consequential amendments for the Health and Safety at Work, General Risk and Workplace Management regulations. The objectives of the bill, as you've indicated, is firstly to reduce unnecessary compliance costs. Now, all of these words are loaded. Unnecessary compliance cost, increase certainty for business and organizations about what they need to do, and support continued reductions in the incidence of workplace fatalities, injuries, and illnesses. And, I'll talk a bit about the bill in a second, but I think fundamentally my view is that it fails on each of those fronts. So I think it actually adds potential cost. I think it adds potential complexity, and it runs a very real risk of not only failing to reduce the level of harm, but potentially increase the level of harm and the cost of that harm to workers, their families, their businesses, ACC, the health system, and all of the others that contributed to that 5.4 billion figure that you talked about. So what does it include? So I guess for me, the thing that I find morally repugnant, and let's put it out there, I don't like it, is that workers in small businesses will have substantially less legal protection for their health and safety than workers in larger businesses. Because what the bill proposes is to reduce the duty on small firms to manage anything other than what is defined as critical risk. So critical risk is a key theme throughout the whole bill. It's about refocusing the Health and Safety at Work Act around critical risk. It's about refocusing WorkSafe and the other regulators around critical risk. And it's about deprioritizing enforcement, but at building education and guidance. And incidentally, I don't have a fundamental problem with that, but the way it's done, I think, is important. So what does this all mean? So critical risk isn't currently defined, but it's something that many of us have been talking about for some time. And generally, it's the stuff that we are most averse to. And that's life-ending and life-altering injuries and cases of ill health, whether that be mental or physical. However, the way in which critical risk is defined in the bill is very convoluted. And I'll let Olivia talk a bit more about that in a moment. But it's really fundamental if we are going to prioritize the system around something, that actually what it is that we're prioritizing is the right thing, and it's described in a way that everybody is clear what it actually means. The next big area, which is completely open-ended, is that it subordinates the Health and Safety at Work Act to other enactments, other pieces of legislation, where the other legislation already has a remit around a particular sector or topic. And basically what it says is if you're complying with that other enactment, then you no longer have a duty under the Health and Safety at Work Act. But with one exception, which is to do with seismic risk under the Building Act, it doesn't describe what those legislative provisions are, and certainly doesn't make any requirement that those other provisions are equally effective or have any regulatory mechanisms associated with them. In fact, it acknowledges that in some instances they may set a lower standard than under the Health and Safety at Work Act. But the primary issue that's being addressed here is that the review does not believe that health and safety legislation should be used as some kind of a regulatory backstop, either in terms of worker or public safety. And again, I'm happy to explore some views that I've got of the pros and cons of that, but that's important. Given this particular audience, another change is around duties for what I'll call executive officers. So as people will know, the definition of an officer under the Health and Safety at Work Act includes chief executives and other people who have similar roles and responsibilities who are deemed officers. What the proposed legislative change says is that where you're an executive officer, when you're acting as an executive, your duties are those of a worker. And when you're acting as an officer in governance roles, your duties of those are of an officer. Doesn't describe what that looks like in practice, doesn't describe what you do differently in your executive role. Obviously, due diligence under the current Section 44, the officer duty, is proactive, whereas the worker duty is very much reactive. So there could be a significant lessening of the duty on officers in that executive role. And obviously, given the High Court appeal that we're still waiting for in the Tony Gibson case, that could be highly influential in actually providing guidance as to what does that actually mean. But potentially a softening of the duties of CEOs and other similar executive officers. A number of other changes, which I don't think are particularly significant. One about landowner duties in relation to recreational activities. Slightly ironic that this is happening against the backdrop of WorkSafe investigating the Mount Maunganui tragedy of a couple of weeks ago. But that would clarify that as a landowner, you have no health and safety duties to people undertaking recreational activities unless either you deliver those recreational activities or you have other work going on at the same time in the same place. So just to recap, focusing the system and the regulator on critical risk, removing obligations on small firms to manage anything other than critical risk, looking at overlapping legislative requirements with Health and Safety at Work Act being subordinated to it, and then some minor changes around officer duties, landlord duties, and also around approved codes of practice, which would then have an enhanced status, something that's already been announced sometime in advance. So I guess that's my sort of initial very high level overview of the changes and some of the areas that I think are particularly problematic.
Thanks, Mike. And as always, good to know what you think about these things straight up.
I'll never leave people wondering.
No, look, I think, and that's why I think it's a really good for people to hear a really clear perspective on it. But around the proposed amendments to the WorkSafe New Zealand Act.
Yes, so that basically separates out functions from primary functions. So it prioritizes the existing functions of WorkSafe, and so reorganizes the section of the WorkSafe Act, which currently lists a whole series of them. So number one is provide guidance, advice, and information on compliance. 2, develop, review, and recommend codes of practice. 3, develop safe work instruments. And then 4, monitor and enforce compliance. And of course, the Minister has already narrowed WorkSafe's focus through the statement of performance expectations. She's already put some limitations around WorkSafe's budget, so they can only spend ring-fenced money on each of those different activities. But this takes it a stage further, and actually, with a consequential amendment in the Health and Safety at Work Act, that similar prioritisation would apply to the 2 other regulators, which is Maritime New Zealand and CAA.
So in that list of those 4 issues you talked about, from guidance and advice, codes, safe work mechanisms, safe work processes, was it safe instruments?
Safe work instruments, yeah.
And then is that an order of stated priority?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, okay,
Yes.
that's how I've read it too, because they're numbered,
Yeah.
not limited, right? Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Mike. So Olivia, again, feel free to add anything to your biography I offensively missed. And what's your take or build on where Mike's sort of laid out the nature of what we're dealing with here?
Yeah, thanks. I'll start at the top, and then we'll probably drill down to a few of the issues that Mike's already touched on. I think my initial reaction was the radical changes and overhaul of the legislation that was, potentially indicated and promised hasn't landed. My take is that the changes are a bit more subdued, and in places are quite subtle. Um, we've talked about the missed opportunity as being thrown around to actually have the courage to do some good work around reducing the ambiguity and uncertainty that is in the legislation. So I think that has been missed. I agree with Mike that I'm not sure that intent. I agree with the intent in terms of the approach that we've had hasn't worked for some reason, although the legislation and our regime is modelled on the UK and Australia, who have similar laws, but our performance, health, and safety outcomes don't match them. So something isn't right for our approach to work and our New Zealand way of doing things. So my view is something needed to change, but it hasn't quite landed. So in terms of the harm reduction, there's no data around how the changes will be achieved. Overall, I think what we will see is that there's a shifting of the burden and responsibility elsewhere to other regulatory systems. So the actual scope and application of the duties under HESWA will be limited and more confined than they currently are if the bill goes through. And also the regulatory reach of WorkSafe, which Mike's just talked about in terms of the functions of WorkSafe, will be narrowed as well. And so they will be confined in terms of their role. We already see in practice that legislative proposed changes already we see it operating in practice with WorkSafe's enforcement policy being released recently, where they're not taking the same sort of enforcement approach as they would otherwise have taken. So in practice, we're already seeing a difference in approach and shift within the regulator.
So there's a couple of things in there that have been sort of running through my mind, and some of the conversations I've been having with others, Olivia, and for both of you, I don't want this question to take up a lot of time, but I think it is useful. I think we're all on the same page that since the Act coming into 2015 of the work of the highly informed by the Independent Task Force, Mike, that you and Rob Jager and Paul Mackay and Mavis Mullins and others were involved in. The idea that it's not worked. We haven't seen the level of reduction in harm that the commensurate investment we've all made and the system has made hasn't eventuated. So the idea of being up for change, I think, was something we will roll up for. I guess my question is any just quick reflections over what hasn't worked, because you want to have the things that haven't worked to be the things that change rather than radical change for the sake of it. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but define the problem is often a pretty useful first place to start on these things, I think. So, Mike.
Yeah, so look, I mean, the task force, obviously, we looked at why the 1992 Act hadn't worked. And the reality was it had never been fully implemented. And if you look at where we are now, 9 years on from the implementation of HASWA, at least half of the recommendations of the independent task force that were agreed by ministers have never happened. And so I'm not sure it's a failure of the legislation. I think it's a failure to fully implement the full package. And, I remember Rob Jager saying to Simon Bridges, who was the minister at the time, the recommendations from the task force are not a Chinese restaurant menu where you can pick and mix. He said they are a carefully woven set of interconnected recommendations. And we actually had on the cover of the report a korowai, a cloak. And so the whole metaphor was around, the warp and weft of the recommendations, because otherwise you leave gaps that things fall through. So the big one was the regulatory infrastructure. And so we said right from the outset that actually the Act describes the principles. the regulations describe the different circumstances in which you need to regulate, and then approved guidance and approved codes of practice provide the detail of how you go about doing it. We've singularly failed to put in place the regulatory mechanisms that provide the certainty of what we're trying to achieve in particular circumstances. You look at the Independent Forestry Safety Review, we asked for forestry regulations. They haven't happened. We've got an ACOP, but no regulations. Plant and machinery, that was all consulted on back in 2017 to 19, never implemented. I did a review a few months ago of all the regulations that they have in place in the UK and Australia and compared it to here, and we've got probably less than a quarter. And so for me, I think the challenge is that we've got this very conceptual high-level act. We've got weak, outdated guidance and very little in the middle in terms of regulations that help provide the tram lines which give us the direction of travel when we're dealing with a particular topic or a particular issue. So there's nothing in this regulatory package that actually addresses that. And whilst having more approved codes is a good idea and allowing industry groups like the Forum or CTU or anybody to write an approved code, it still very much depends on WorkSafe's resources and expertise to make sure that any such code is set at the right level, that it describes best practice, not lowest common denominator, that it's been developed based on, talking to relevant stakeholders, including workers, and most importantly, that it's kept up to date. And so I think the problem is, as you say, understanding why things went wrong before and understanding that actually it's not fair to blame the current act or the current regulator, because actually most of that infrastructure that was necessary was never completed.
Olivia, I mean, what's your take on?
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, that's what distinguishes us in terms of UK and Australia. And when clients come to me and they say, what does best practice look like? Where's the guidance, the guidelines? I always refer them to Australia because they're a decade ahead of us for what that looks like, and they're moving forward in a whole range of spaces that we're actually going backwards with the introduction of this bill, and psychosocial hazards being one of those. So I absolutely agree with what Mike has said. I think that is significant, though, when we look at the makeup of our businesses here, and that's why there's, I think that the whole issue around the small business, like PCBU duty versus large PCBU obligations, is going to cause issues, because this is stereotyping. Most small organisations are not well placed in terms of capability and capacity to implement effective risk management. They just are not well set up for that. And so that's where the gap around what does good look like in practice, where the ACOPs, the regulation, the guidance, the safe work instruments would actually fill that gap, and they would be able to lift and apply that in their operations. So absolutely agree with that. The ACOPs is one good thing that I think will come out of this, but there's only 2 that are currently recognised which would meet that obligation. So I don't have much confidence, unless organisations are going to be funded and resourced, WorkSafe included, as part of their shift in priority to actually get those ACOPs in place to bridge the gap. It's taken 10 years and we haven't seen much work in that space at all. So agree with that. I think the one area where I would have was hopeful that there would have been some amendments to, where I think that there has been a waste, is the CCC obligation. So the overlapping duties and how that plays out in practice. I think that is uncertain. That does create a duplication of resources and wasted time and energy that doesn't have any material impact on health and safety outcomes. And so when they said, that may be on the table, it was overlapping legislative duties, not actually.
It was the wrong overlap, right? It was.
Yeah. So my initial thought was like, yes, we're going to have some clarity around that, but wishful thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think this, like I said, I'm keen for us to move on back into the specific amendments, because that's what we've been given to constrain. But I think maybe if I think about the regulatory infrastructure and the regulatory system, the primary duty is around identification and managing risks, and regulations and codes and direction from the regulator is almost where the controls kind of sit. And so this idea of critical risk management, as you sort of indicated, Mike, a journey that, particularly the company that we tend to be in this group call, it has been well across. Critical risk isn't all about risk ID. It's about risk ID and control. And it's the control that's magic. There's the magic ingredient that takes you there. My sense is the missing gap around that lack of implementation is it's big on the risk, and then there's this massive gap where that lack of clarity and ambiguity flows through about how do I manage the risks is the big gap. And I wonder, for us to be able to dig back into throughout the call, the easiest thing to help small businesses and get rid of duplication and all that administrative overload, I would have thought, Olivia, my hypothesis would be clarity of regulation and good guidance flowing from that, so you can just crack on with the how, not sort of philosophical navel gazing around the what. So maybe we use that as a segue to tip into the critical risk conversation around a statutory definition of critical risk. My reading of it is there's going to be a new schedule in the Health and Safety at Work Act and a revised Schedule 2A in the ACC Act, which will basically be an inventory of either regulations or high-risk activities or illnesses, which you need to then look at your own organisation and say, are any of those present? If yes, I have to prioritise those, with a catch-all that says, hey, is it likely we have any hazards that could result in fatality or serious injury? That's the basic process that's been proposed?
Yeah, so the definition of a critical risk, as you say, is got two dimensions. So one is well defined. So anything which is subject to health and safety regulation, so asbestos, adventure activities, hazardous substances, pressure equipment, cranes, and passenger roadways, they are deemed to be critical risks. So that's pretty simple and straightforward, and it's just simply a restatement of the fact that if you've got regulations, then you've got to comply with them. So no big shift there. But we know that actually, as I was saying earlier on, there's a huge amount of areas of risk which isn't subject to regulation. And so for those, the obligation is to basically go back to first principles and say, is this ? Hazard or ? Risk likely to give rise to a WorkSafe notifiable event, fatality, notifiable injury, notifiable disease, notifiable dangerous occurrence, or likely to give rise to an ACC Schedule 2 occupational disease. Now, what does that mean? Who assesses what's likely? That was changed in the drafting of the bill, and apparently at the minister's behest, to move from may or could reasonably foreseeably, which is about inherent potential, about energy, into likely. So is likely 30%, 50%, 70%? Is it likely in my business, in my context? Is it likely with or without controls? Right. It's completely undefined at the moment. And so if as an individual business, particularly a small business, you can say, well, I've assessed my risk of riding quad bikes on my farm, and I don't think it's likely to give rise to a death or serious injury. Therefore, I don't need to do anything.
And my rationale in that case, Mike, would be because it's not. I've owned that quad bike for 20 years and it's not happened to date. Therefore, history projected. So that would be my defense. And in the absence of a definition, that would be maybe a potential response I could take.
Yeah. So leaving it so loose actually adds to that regulatory uncertainty. That was one of the key objectives for the legislation. But then we've got this bit about prioritizing, and thank you, Tanya, who's made a point about that. So prioritizing says three things. You've got to manage critical risks before managing other risks. You've got to monitor, review, and revise controls relating to critical risk more often than controls relating to other risks. And you've got to apply a higher proportion of risk management resource to the management of critical risks compared to other risks. However, failing to prioritise is not an offence.
Right. So you could do none of that and you won't have a particular offence related to that failure.
Yeah. Yeah. So, really this sounds to me like guidance. I mean, if we take the forum's guidance on critical risk, it says, hey guys, we know that killing people is not a good place to be. We know that permanently disabling people is not a good place to be. So this is how you lean into critical risk. And this is what you do to assess it properly, to identify, benchmark standards, to implement control, to monitor and verify those controls, and to continuously improve. That's all it says. But actually, it doesn't say any of that, because it just says monitor, review, and revise controls more often than controls related to other risks. It doesn't say how, doesn't say anything about process. And the fact that it's not an enforceable duty means for firms that aren't SMEs, it's to take it or leave it.
Yeah. So, Olivia, I mean, what's your take on that from a defence perspective? Are there a few holes in there you could latch on to?
Yeah, well, there's likely to is used in a number of other enactments, so we would draw on that. But the way I see that playing out in practice is the catch-all essentially is lining up organisations with WorkSafe priorities and where they will intervene, because it's linking it with death, notifiable injury, illness, incident, and that's when they will intervene and when you're required to notify. So I'm actually quite comfortable with that side of it. I think the gap is it's all around identifying what is a critical risk, but doesn't bridge the gap in as to how do you effectively control that. But that's another thing. So just getting back to what that catch-all test is, the way that I see it is the obligation is you as an organisation would need to, once you've gone through that specified hazard list and the schedule, and ticked off all of that as it applies to your operations and activities, you would then need to carry out an assessment that are there any other hazards that would likely result in. And the way that I interpret likely result in is it's focused on consequence only. And what will, I think, happen is you'll move away from that whole standard risk matrix approach where you're looking at consequence and likelihood rating, to then give it a risk rating as to priorities within your organisation and controls implemented. So the focus is solely on if something happens. So if that hazard happened, would it be reasonably expected to cause death, a notifiable injury, or a notifiable incident? The likelihood of it happening or not because of whatever factor goes away. It's just, is that consequence something that would be a real and substantial risk of arising if the hazard eventuated? So it's not more likely than not. So there is case law and other definitions you can draw on there.
You see, I would like to agree with you that that's what it's about, because I think if you look at the inherent potential, which is that energy-based safety kind of approach that says, is there enough energy here that if it's released from falling from height or hitting you or explosion or electricity or whatever, that it could give rise to those injuries, then you're dealing with, as you say, the inherent potential. But the fact that the minister changed the wording from may to likely suggests that she is looking at introducing some assessment of likelihood. But as I say, whether that's at the risk level in terms of globally falls from height, or are we saying it's applied to your business based on, do I work 2 meters above the ground or 10 meters above the ground, which is then, very subjective as to whether you've got a duty or not. So I could quite happily live with the definition of critical risk, leaving aside the exemption of small firms, if it was based on purely reasonably foreseeable consequence. Yeah.
And if a client came to me and said, well, how do we interpret that now? The two phrases that I would draw on where we see in other legislation is it's a real and substantial risk. That's language use, and it's something, it's not more than likely than not. That's too high. So it's an objective test. But that's one of the criticisms of the Act, that's going to create uncertainty around how people do that catch-all assessment as to what's in and what's out.
And of course, given there's going to be less prosecution action taken, then we're going to get less jurisprudence from the courts to guide us on how they interpret it. So that again adds to an uncertainty, because any jurisprudence that we've got under the current settings may not be directly applicable once we change the legislative requirement.
So, I mean, again, if we come back to the objective of the amendments around improving clarity and improving simplification, there's been a lot in this conversation, and it's around what's a critical risk, let alone the more important piece, which is how do you manage them. But I quite like, I think one of the things we're very mindful of in our own submission, and for those that we're going to be encouraging to make their own, is what can we put forward so if we're dealing with this definition, what would make it better? And so I think I'm hearing this idea about making it clearer that it's about the sort of inherent objective risk, rather than necessarily trying to count likelihood angels on the end of a pin.
Yeah,
okay, that's a useful call out. Now, by the way, team, I can see the questions here. I'm just looking at some natural progress of the conversation, so they will be addressed. If we then think about moving from critical risk into, then I guess what that also means from the small business piece is that's all I have to manage. I don't have to manage really anything else at that point. But small businesses, I've heard the rumor, sometimes work for big businesses. In fact, big businesses are highly reliant on small business. So what do we understand, or what are the questions that are popping up to your mind around needing to work through this small business carve out from a big business's perspective? Because I'm working on the assumption there's going to be very few, if any, small businesses on this call. So sitting in the shoes of our business leaders, forum members, what are the implications here around 95% of New Zealand businesses not having to worry about musculoskeletal, psychosocial, lower back pain, and a whole range of other things that just don't hit that threshold? Olivia, maybe start with you.
Yeah, well, it's going to shift the risk allocation in the supply chain. So the way I see it is it's currently framed up, and we'll get into the definition and what it actually potentially could mean and some of the uncertainty. But to answer your question, there's a risk there that large PCBUs will have greater exposure for contractor failures, and the current risk allocation across the supply chain and contracts probably is not going to mirror the statutory duties and what's required. So there will be a shifting of responsibilities and resources. I think it'll lead to disputes about who's responsible for certain risks when there is an incident or event occurs. For me, I think that there is an issue with the definition as to what is a small PCBU. The whole 9 out of 12 months is going to drive behaviour around how the entity is structured and established, different contracting methods just to get around a higher obligation if you are a large PCBU. The other thing that I see challenging is that the definition of worker has not changed, and that may have been overlooked or it may not have, but the definition of worker is wide, and so it includes the workers of contractors or workers that you have direction, control, or influence over in terms of a work activity. So it's divorced from reality. You could have a small PCBU come into a large construction site, and how do they count who the workers are at that point in time? It'd be over, it could easily get you into the large PCBU. Yeah. So
and building on that piece, and then Mike, I'll let you have at it. I mean, there's a couple sort of allied questions coming through here around this two-tier approach. Does that mean when big businesses engage small, they take on the responsibilities of those that don't apply to the small businesses? Questions here around, will large businesses have to increase their PCBU obligations when they're working with small? There's this risk allocation piece you were talking about, Olivia. So my sense is, yes, it will put more duty on you as a larger business. The dilemma is that's going to be different for every single larger business on how they're doing that. So rather than having a consistent set of expectations coming through in addition to mine, I'm having to do more heavy lifting than maybe I would have had to others. But Mike, I might be missing something.
Oh, look, I mean, there are so many officials here. This is why, to use that, that old joke about asking for directions, I wouldn't start from here. So, my fundamental premise is this is wrong, and it's wrong at so many levels. So large business employing small business on construction site, well, contractually, you have to meet the requirements of the contractor's health and safety plan. So you can't have employees of small businesses saying, I'm not going to wear a hard hat because I don't think it's a critical risk for my people. The site rules, the site requirements will apply to everybody. And so I think what we're going to have is a strengthening of the contractual obligation, which don't just say comply with all applicable laws and health and safety requirements that apply to you, but it will say follow all of our contractual requirements in terms of our health and safety plan. But looking at the other way around, what about if we've got a small project management company that's got under 20 employees managing a multi-million-dollar construction project? So now the small firm doesn't have the obligation, but the large firms do. The other thing is that it doesn't just affect downstream duties to workers, it affects upstream duties. So if you're a small firm who imports, supplies, installs, designs equipment for use at work, then your upstream duties will only apply to critical risks. And of course, many importers in this country will be small because they're essentially just an office that brings equipment into the country, on behalf of overseas suppliers, and acts as that crucial intermediary who currently carries all of that New Zealand liability for making sure that what they're selling is fit for purpose. So there's lots and lots of fishhooks around the small large divide. It goes against the fundamental principle of a performance-based, risk-based legislative regime. And in practice, all of the things that we've talked about. Today, I'm working for a large firm, so I have to train, instruct, supervise, and provide PPE for my staff. Tomorrow, I'm working for Francois on his house, so I don't have to provide any of those. Today, I'm a small firm. Next month, I'm a big firm. The year after, I'm a small firm again. So, you're just coming in and out of this regulatory regime based on a series of, of variables which could tip you one way or another multiple times over the course of a year or the life of the business. That doesn't provide consistency and clarity. It's just a recipe for further confusion.
And if I come back to your earlier point, Olivia, around one of the things you were hoping to see around the overlapping responsibility, which is greater clarity and interpretation of the 3 Cs, we've almost done something we've almost gone the opposite direction of potentially further muddying the waters around those really critical and sometimes complex interfaces between business, because all of a sudden the big small thing is a legal issue, not just a cultural capability issue.
Yeah, and I wonder that's one of the evils they've been trying to fix, why they've come up with this bizarre way. In practice, it will be nearly impossible to advise clients around how that obligation would play out in practice. To me, where I see it arising, and we've seen it already under the current legislation, it's where does the cost of compliance sit? So if you've got a legal obligation that's not required, and you've got a large PCBU or the head contractor saying, no, you meet our standards, this is a contractual requirement, they'll say, well, it's not a legal one, so we're not paying for it. So is it a shifting of that obligation around cost and resourcing and capability to those who are better placed to manage it? And there may be an argument around that, but the way it's currently framed, it's a dog's breakfast. I've tried to kind of scenario base it as to, if someone came and asked me how we work through this, I can't figure it out.
There's also potential for gaming, because you can imagine that, rather than growing your business above 20, then you'll say, we've got Francois contractors North Island, Francois contractors South Island, each of which now are, the small firms.
So there's a range of sort of observations I might just sort of come back. So, tenders won't be apples for apples with bigger companies and smaller ones. Big ones larger companies bids for various things, depending on what it is, will almost implicitly carry more cost because they've got more ambits. I mean, I'm seeing nods. I think the answer is yes, Wayne, you're dead right. I think that is potentially what could happen. I think this question that David Fuller raises around driving smaller, but the unintended consequence, particularly from a political, if I'm just allowing myself to cast into the politics of this, which is supporting the backbone of New Zealand industry, which is small business, I know from some conversations, some proactive calls I've had from some CEO members in this last week, they're really clear that they prefer to work with bigger ones if this situation comes through. So, any thoughts around unintended consequences of just literally squeezing smaller businesses out of some markets?
That's a potential outcome, I think.
Yeah.
There's a piece here around the commercial bit, but I'm going to read this question out fully, just because I'm not 100% sure. So, will there be any weighted considerations for small subcontractors taking on larger scopes from a contractual engagement perspective, fundamentally an increase of risk and exposure to the main contract? So, weighted considerations. I mean, again, it's just come back to the dog's breakfast, and Olivia, you're left with nothing but a lack of clarity on how to resolve those thoughts.
Yeah, it's the conceptual challenge we have of actually applying it in practice and how work is done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is there, in the spirit of constructive, because New Zealand needs to get better and we need to make as many constructive, is there any way we can put any feedback on this one in particular? Like you went on the critical piece, Mike, you said you could live with that definition if. Is there anything in the big small piece from either of your perspectives that we could go back to, that any of us could consider going back to change this, to turn it into something remotely workable?
No. In simple terms, the size of the business is not determinative of the level of risk, and it's inversely correlated with the ability of the business to manage the risk.
Mm-hmm.
The ACC statistics show that small firms are inherently more dangerous than larger firms, because very often they don't have the resources and the capability and whatever to manage risks as well as a large, well-resourced organization. So, the fundamental principle that we've been working on here, for a number of years, and UK, for 50 years, is that you have to have a level playing field, but which is based on fundamental principles of proportionate response to the level of risk in your context. And your context may change, and the level of risk and the response to that risk needs to change. But anything other than that, we risk going back to either exempting workers from levels of protection. The last time we tried this was about worker engagement. If you remember trying to exempt small firms from having to have health and safety reps and health and safety committees. And, you can see some logic in that. There's, look, if I've only got 10 guys, I don't need to have a committee, I don't need to have a rep. We just sit down around the smoko room and discuss it. But do you remember all the arguments about trying to find what was a small, low-risk business, about worm farms?
Yeah.
Good days, that proved how problematic it was. Yeah. And I think this is the same. Yeah. So my view is that for me, and as the spokesperson for the New Zealand Institute of Safety Management, the exemption of duties for certain groups of workers in small firms is a non-negotiable. We can't live with that. The critical risk prioritisation, the fact that it's not an enforceable duty, be nice to clarify it. I'm not sure this is the way of doing it, but it doesn't make much difference. The officer duty probably doesn't make much difference. The landlord duty probably doesn't make much difference. The other enactments is also highly dangerous because it's completely open-ended. And so the conclusion I'm left with is that there's nothing substantial of value in here which justifies wasting scarce parliamentary time and businesses' focus to actually change just for having the benefit of industry developed approved codes, which is probably a good idea.
I mean, I think there's a couple of questions here that sort of go to also implementation considerations. So, Mike, I think a lot of what you stated there is really useful food for thought. If we think about that asymmetry of risk based on asymmetry of size rather than risk and where the effort goes, there's a question here from George around: do we have any clarity about how WorkSafe would actually pursue tackling enforcement in that sort of asymmetric, non-risk-based asymmetric environment. And I mean, Olivia, obviously you're often brought in at that point where enforcement might be on the table. Any confidence from either of you whether there's what the implications could be for WorkSafe in this space?
Well, they're backing right away from taking enforcement. If we're talking about prosecutions, we can already see that. So quite clearly the minister has said if it's grey and it's uncertain, don't go there. And it's only where it's serious failures, where there's clear, understanding around risk and controls, where they will prosecute, and repeated incidents of that as well. So I doubt it they will intervene, and we will have a period, if the current policy position remains as it is, where they will not be out with their stick and they will be focused on guidance, information, ACOPs, and that's it. Yeah.
And lower level enforcement. So, improvement notices, well, when we get caught, then we have to fix it. But, there's no sanction behind that in terms of either financial penalty or some other redress.
And even lower than that, we're starting to see come through, which is the first time that I've seen it, but warnings. So like some other regulators, where they will give a warning for a breach, and they'll ask, I've seen one where they've asked for consent that you will agree to the warning, but not going so far as an improvement or a prohibition notice around you're required to do X, Y, Z by this date. It's just we're warning you. You're in breach of your obligations, and that's it, and it will stay on your record. And if there's another matter that we know about, we'll consider it as part of our response.
I wish police took that approach with my speeding tickets from time to time, Olivia, because I always intend to follow good guidance,
Yes, yeah.
And I will learn with more encouragement along the way, but without being too ridiculous. Having been joining the Department of Labour in 2006. There was a significant period of de-emphasising any level of sharp-edged enforcement preceding that 4 years preceding the Pike River explosion. So I think that adding further...
Is it any wonder I left the Department of Labour in 2007?
Yeah, I couldn't possibly comment. So if we stay with the implementation piece, again, there's a question here from Simon around that critical list schedule 1A and 2A in ACC Act, about that being reviewed and amended. So first, a factual question: is there any mention in any of the amendment language around there being anything about review and monitoring of the currency of those two schedules?
So there's what's called a Henry VIII clause, which I'm sure Olivia can explain far better than I can. But basically, what that says is it allows secondary legislation, I think, to override primary legislation. So an order in council can be made to amend Schedule 1A. So basically, if another set of regulations is passed, then an order in council can simply say, add it to the list. The ACC Schedule 2 is completely different, of course, because that is about the scope of what is compensable under the ACC Act. So there is no power under the Health and Safety Amendment Act to change what ACC compensates. It simply said if ACC compensates it, like mesothelioma, although actually that doesn't really matter because it's covered by the asbestos regulations. Noise-induced hearing loss, probably a good example. So ACC covers noise-induced hearing loss under Schedule 2. So actually the risk of somebody getting noise-induced hearing loss would be considered a critical risk.
Right. Because I think that question of ongoing sort of what I call system stewardship is a really important one, that if we come back to the independent task force conclusion in 2012-13 of the 92 Act, lack of implementation, your assessment, which I think we would all agree with, lack of implementation where we are now, the idea of further prescription and reliant on government schedules and lists that will be maintained and updated. I don't think it's skeptical to say actually history would suggest that that's a weak point. That needs to be certainly considered around ongoing maintenance.
Can I just add one other thing, Francois? And it's in the chat from Scott. So Paul Harrison from ShopCare has been doing some great work, probably aided by Claude, actually looking at what the possible implications of these changes are for free trade agreements. So if we take the really macro view, which many people on the call, will be interested in what's happening at a global level, there is a suggestion, and they've looked at it in quite some detail, that these changes might potentially put at risk the free trade agreements with EU and UK, and certainly would put at risk our conformance with the International Labour Organization conventions on worker health and safety, which, if you recall, in 2022, was considered a fundamental human right. And yet we're potentially removing that fundamental human right from potentially large numbers of people working for small firms. So, there's a domestic element to this, but potentially there is also an international dimension in terms of FTAs.
Yeah, different. I hadn't even really joined the dots on that one, Mike. So thanks. And good workshop here. Now we've got 4 minutes to go. What I'm going to suggest we do is, Summer, if you could put the poll up for people just about to give us some soundings and some data points around how you're feeling about today's conversation and forming your views around the amendment, that would be really helpful. We'd really appreciate that. And maybe while we're doing that, just any final comments or reflections from you, Olivia?
Yeah, probably just a last quick comment. Mike's already touched on it, but that compliance with other legislation, I'm actually wishful that might provide some clarity. In my practice, that's been an area where it has been uncertain, and in a number of areas where clients have come to us and said, what are our obligations, particularly when there's a different description of standards, what's the hierarchy, is it HASWA? So, examples of where we might see that playing out in practice would be land transport, maritime, aviation, building and construction, electrical work, hazardous substances, food safety, health and disability. So I'm hopeful that will help. But the problem that we will have, I suspect, is that if WorkSafe scope is narrowed and they're saying it's them and it's not us, those other regulatory systems and regulators stood up to actually fill that gap and enforce those standards. And I'm not sure that that's there.
That's a really, really very helpful, I think, bill, Olivia, in terms of being able to say, look, I think the intent of that amendment has real merit, but it's got some contingent capability that I think I'm thinking for our own submission, but also for anyone making their own independent submission, would be, how do we help the select committee make sure they're really attending to exactly those?
So what I've done, Francois, in the draft submission for entered ISM is I've actually drafted an alternative clause, which is an enabling one that actually says, where particular circumstances have been determined, that they can actually then be designated as being within or without, because that covers all of those areas that we've got confusion around: independent police conduct authority, the defence force, clinical risk in healthcare, where there might be some tidying up that's appropriate, because WorkSafe doesn't have the primary interest, the capacity, or the expertise, but another regulator's already working in that space.
Nice. Mike, thank you. Olivia, thank you. What I want to do is just thank you both for your time and your frankness and your consideration. You've both, in your various roles, sat and seen these things from a bunch of different perspectives. So I think it's a really invaluable range of input to certainly inform me and hopefully others on the call. Summer, if we could just put up a final slide. As I said earlier, the forum is looking to produce our own submission. In the spirit of democracy, we've been given less time than usual to be able to form our views. So by 18th of March, working backwards, we have the deadline for everybody around written submissions is 18 March. We will have ready for all members, so mark this in your calendar, between the 9th and the 11th, you are going to have a draft submission from us to provide feedback on. That'll be going out to all of our CEOs and supporting communities around the health and safety groups, so to be able to put that back. So make your views on that submission known. We are really seeking to encourage all of you to make a submission in your own right. Numbers count for this government in particular, and we will have ready for you, sending out tomorrow, a simple little sort of submission pack to inform and enable you to do that as easily as possible, with a simple template and some analysis that we've undertaken. As you can see, 18th of March we're there, and on the 12th of June there is the actual select committee report back. We'll be looking to make our own oral submission. I would encourage everybody to try and do the same. I'm a walking embodiment of the liberal elite as far as this government's concerned, people. I've got a French name, I've got a silly haircut, and I've got health and safety in my job description. You are people of business out there. Our members are business people. And I think the more Select Committee hears from people of business talking about the things that they want to see, opportunities missed, and the changes that would make this workable, the better. So I'm going to leave that as my sign off to say thanks for coming along, everybody. Really appreciate it. Mike, Olivia, thanks again for your help, and onwards, everybody. Thanks very much.
Thanks all.
Thank you.